Well, good morning, and thank you all for coming. For those of you who don't know me, my name is John Sylvester. I'm a partner here at K&L Gates, and I'm delighted to host this Brexit briefing. I know a lot of folks in the business community here in Pittsburgh are sort of wondering what's happening and how does it affect them, and hopefully we can answer some of those questions for you. Just a little briefing on the agenda. We're going to have presentations by our three panelists, who I'll introduce in a minute. And then after that, we're going to have what we hope will be a lively Q&A session for members of the audience and some questions that have been submitted in advance. And so if you have a question, what I would ask is that you just hold it to the end of the presentations, and then we'll get to it and try to address it. I would like to say that, several months ago when we planned this Brexit briefing and planned the date of April 12th, that at the time we thought, well, we'll be able to provide clarity and certainty for everybody because March 29th was the absolute drop-dead date by which a plan had to be approved and implemented and enforced. So we would then have a couple of weeks after the dust cleared to tell you what exactly are the arrangements and how are they going to work. Obviously, that didn't come to pass, and a short extension was granted. And when the short extension was granted, April 12th, today, was the date by which, if no agreement had been reached, this was going to be the crash-out date, the date when Britain was going to leave the EU with no deal, and chaos would ensue. And so for the last couple of weeks, we thought maybe today will be the chaos date. But as you know, cooler heads prevailed earlier this week, and another extension until Halloween of this year has been granted. And so today we will have neither clarity, certainty, nor chaos. But hopefully we'll have a little bit of information about what to expect with impending Brexit. And who knows, maybe we'll come back on Halloween of this year and do this all over again and tell you why we were all wrong about what we were predicting. But no, we have a tremendous panel of speakers who have been thinking and studying and writing and speaking about Brexit and its implications, both on a global and on a microeconomic scale for individual businesses, and so we're delighted to have them. Before I introduce them, I just wanted to recognize our partner organizations that are co-hosting this program with us. First is the RAND Corporation, which many of you know is a global policy research firm that has offices in the U.S., Europe, and Australia. And we're very fortunate to have one of RAND Corporation's research offices here in Pittsburgh, out in Oakland, near the universities. They are one of our co-sponsors, as is KPMG, which of course everybody knows is a international organization that focuses on tax auditing and advisory services. And they've, of course, got offices around the world and here in Pittsburgh. And our third partner organization may be one that you're a little less familiar with. It's called British American Connections Pittsburgh, the BACP, or as it's commonly referred to, Britsburg. And what that organization is, on whose board I sit and many others here in the community, it's an organization that is focused on trying to strengthen the ties, whether they be cultural, business ties, educational, or other ties between the Pittsburgh region and the UK. And I'd like to recognize the chairman of the BACP, Robert Charlesworth, who's there. He has on his lapel the Britsburg trademark symbol, the black and gold Union Jack. So if you see some of their literature out there and are interested in the organization, feel free to look it up on the web. What I'll next do before we get started is just introduce very briefly the three speakers that you're going to hear from. And then after that, we'll have, as I said, the Q&A session, as well as a visiting attendee from London who's going to appear here in about an hour or so. Ambassador Charles Rees, who's now a vice president of the RAND Corporation, will be our first speaker. And Charlie has a long and very storied career at the State Department and the U.S. Diplomatic Corps. I can't go through all of his different diplomatic posts, but a few of them of particular interest. He served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs during the period 2000 to 2004. And Charlie was stationed both in London and in Brussels, representing the U.S. in a number of trade and other matters of interest both to the U.S. and to Europe and the U.K. And so he has a very unique perspective on sort of the global implications of Brexit from many different perspectives of many different countries. He also served as the U.S. ambassador to Greece from 2004 to 2007. And after that, did some real difficult duty as a coordinator of economic transition in Iraq, serving in Baghdad from 2007 to 2008. He's now, as I said, a vice president of the RAND Corporation, and he oversees RAND's international offices. Our second speaker will be our own Piers Coleman from K&L Gates, London. Piers heads the firm's Brexit advisory team, which is a team of interdisciplinary lawyers that we have over in not just the UK, but also on the continent of Europe and offices in Brussels and other cities to advise clients on the implications of Brexit and what it means for their particular organizations. Piers also happens to be an expert in British electoral law, having advised many candidates and political parties in the UK, and also involved in elections for UK representatives to the EU Parliament. So again, he has a lot of inside knowledge with regard to all of the back and forth that has been going on in the Houses of Parliament, both in London and in Brussels. And then finally, last certainly but not least, Chris Roberts, who's a principal and UK head of tax at KPMG. Chris has extensive experience in international tax matters, and like Charlie and Piers, he has written, spoken, and appeared in many panels to talk about the implications of Brexit, and he's going to talk about some very specific implications for U.S. businesses facing the inevitable or seemingly inevitable split between the UK and the EU. So, as I said, I will now turn it over to our first speaker, Ambassador Charlie Rees, and then we'll come back afterwards after the presenters for Q&A. So, Charlie, would you like to come up?
Well, thanks very much, John, and thanks to K&L Gates and KPMG, and indeed for welcoming us and putting this on today. RAND has been in Pittsburgh for 19 years, and we really feel very much part of this community. It's a very, very popular office within RAND for our staff, and they very much feel that they are in the best of all of our offices, and given the fact that one of the other ones is by the beach in Santa Monica, that's pretty good. So last week, the Daily Telegraph reported that the British government had banned April Fool's jokes because in the current state of the Brexit process, no one could tell what a joke was. But it's, of course, an April Fool's joke, but only really just. And in the lead of the article on page 1 last week, the New York Times referred to Brexit's long-running theater of the absurd. I actually think that's a little unfair to Samuel Beckett, who had a firmer grasp on his plot. What we've learned so far from Brexit, what's likely to happen, and what it will mean for business in the U.S. more broadly, that's what I'm going to try and tackle. And I look very much forward to the comments of Piers and Chris, and hopefully together and with all of your contributions, we can sort this all out. Now, I appreciate that you've probably been following the dramatic events in the British Parliament and the European Council, and I can assure you that nothing similar has ever taken place in history. Today could have been, as you mentioned, John, extra special as the day that Brexit formally occurred, but in the latest plot twist 2 days ago, the European Council gave Britain a flextension, another a neologism that has resulted from this process, allowing it to remain a member state of the EU for 6.5 months until Halloween, unless it approves the withdrawal agreement before then. So to inform the subsequent discussion, I thought I would give everyone a reduced Shakespeare quick history of the US, the UK, and the EU, and the various terms that have been bandied about for post-Brexit trade relations. I promise it'll be worth it later. We sometimes forget that the European Economic Community, later renamed the European Union, is a direct result of one of the far-sighted acts of American diplomacy, the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan required the Europeans to cooperate economically in order to qualify for U.S. economic assistance for the war-ravaged continent. The shared experience in rebuilding Europe's coal, steel, and industrial capacity led Europeans to the idea of creating the European Economic Community. And when the Treaty of Rome that created the EEC in 1957, Britain chose not to join. In the 1960s, it changed its mind, affected by the faster economic growth on the continent than Britain was experiencing, but Charles de Gaulle repeatedly vetoed the British application. Britain was able to join in 1973 along with Ireland and Denmark, but second thoughts emerged quickly, and they had their first referendum in 1975 because the leftists, the Socialist Left Labour Party at the time, wanted out. But the referendum result was to stay in because of the strong support of the Tory party. Including by Margaret Thatcher. But over the years since, the British Euroscepticism has grown, especially in the Tory party, egged on by Margaret Thatcher's objections to budget formulas, perceived loss of power to Brussels, and a lot of wildly exaggerated scare stories about EU regulations in the British tabloid press. And more recently, anxieties about migration and economic inequality. So to cope with the corrosive Tory party divisions on the subject, in 2013, then Prime Minister David Cameron proposed that if the Tories won the next election, the UK would renegotiate aspects of the UK's relationship to Brussels and put the results to another referendum on whether to stay in. People quickly forgot about the details of the renegotiation and focused on the referendum. That was the basis for the referendum held June 23, 2016, and it was settled by a margin of 52 to 48% in favor of leave. Cameron then resigned. Theresa May took over as prime minister with a mandate to make Brexit happen. That's the reduced Shakespeare version. Now, a couple of key terms to explain. Free movement of peoples is guaranteed by the EU treaties. It means that any EU citizen can freely live and work in any other EU member state. It is one of the four freedoms in the treaty, the others being free movement of goods, capital, and services. Article 50 of the treaty sets the terms for any departures, and it's actually a recent addition. These are very unfavorable to the leaving country and by design. Once it gives notice, the leaver is out in 2 years, unless all the other European Union countries agree to an extension. This is the first go for the Article 50 process, the British leaving, and in using it, the EU has also insisted, although this isn't really quite so clear in the treaty, that Britain agree first to the terms of its departure before it gets to discuss its future trading relationship. The EU also insisted that the UK agree to a hefty financial settlement and the famous backstop to ensure that there would be no border checks in Ireland before they get to talk about trade arrangements. More on this, of course, later. The European Union is a customs union, which means that it applies a common external tariff to all goods entering the EU from abroad, with no tariffs between its members. But until the 1960s, it still had border checks. Until the 1980s, it still had border checks to deal with differences in regulations. At that time, in the 1980s, as part of the EC 92 initiative, the EU undertook to pass over 250 separate laws to put in place a single market to eliminate those border checks on goods. The EU today has a customs union with Turkey, but there are border checks on trade between Turkey and the EU, and they have deals with Norway and Switzerland that allow them to participate in the single market. Both pay into the EU budget for the privilege, and Norway grants free movement for EU citizens to live and work in the EU. Another key trade term to define. The EU has free trade agreements with a number of countries, most notably Canada and Korea, and is discussing one with Japan. In FTAs, participants eliminate, in theory, all tariffs between them, but they can continue quotas and other barriers and often maintain different regulatory systems. They have border checks too. The NAFTA, for example, is an FTA, as are our agreements, U.S. agreements with Korea, Australia, and other countries. Now, if Brexit happens and the EU doesn't enter into a customs union with the EU, the UK and the US have discussed putting in place an FTA between us. But there would be many difficult issues, politically difficult issues to work out, not the least of which have to do with agriculture. If Britain ends up in a post-Brexit customs union with the EU, it would not be able to agree to an FTA with the US or any other partner unless the EU did it as well. Now, Britain formally notified the EU that it wanted to withdraw March 29, 2017. That set in motion the two-year clock that would have led to March 29, 2019. And in the 2 years since, the withdrawal agreement, the terms of departure, and the backstop, along with general non-binding political declaration on future relations and a transition agreement have been worked out, collectively called Theresa May's deal. That's what failed to gain a majority 3 times in Parliament. So last week, up against the wall of the crash out, Prime Minister May, trying to demonstrate some forward movement, invited opposition leader Corbyn to see if they could work on a common proposal that would impress the Europeans, or to agree between themselves to accept a parliamentary vote on something that would gain a majority. Haven't agreed, but the EU, in the end, had to face the question of whether to support an extension anyway. So what have we learned from this process thus far? I think the first point to make is that Leavers really didn't expect to win the 2016 referendum. This now seems to be a commonplace observation, but it has had fundamental and continuing implications for the course of the negotiations and the consequent political future for Britain. Since they didn't expect to win, and they didn't have the support of the government's policy apparatus, Brexit advocates never resolved the basic contradictions in their argument for leaving. When the May government swung around to making Brexit mean Brexit, these contradictions weren't tackled first. Leavers had these 2 contradictory impulses. On the one hand, anti-immigration, nativist, anti-globalization arguments, similar to those in the US in the last election. And the other, a Singapore of the Atlantic vision that Britain, freed of the EU's trade policy, could do much better in international competition. For the first group, Leavers insisted on exiting the single market and stopping free movement, making a Switzerland or Norway solution untenable. And for the second, trade policy independence was supreme, which ruled out a customs union and immediately put at risk the Good Friday solution in Northern Ireland. If Leavers were all on one side or the other, or had thought through the issues before the referendum, it all would have gone much more smoothly. And, of course, the bread and circuses, EU mockery, fake news strands of the Leave movement, epitomized by Boris Johnson, made serious policy discussions that much tougher. Second, and as a result, the negotiations process was messy. Some have called it shambolic on the British side. Theresa May decided at the outset that she had to keep Tory Leavers on side for the sake of party unity. That drove the early Article 50 filing in March 2017, before they really knew what they wanted, and also threw away much of British leverage with the rest of the EU. There is no evidence that in that first year, 2016-2017, the British government understood what a problem Ireland would be. There was rapid turnover in key ministers covering Brexit, and Britain never established an early and cooperative problem-solving approach with Dublin, even though it should have been clear that they would need one. The British did briefly try with the Irish, but the Dublin cannily put its chips on Brussels to serve its interests. Now, Britain had a strong cadre of Europeanists and a tradition of success in working in Brussels, yet May made no use of her retired mandarins and forced out its ambassador to the EU, Ivan Rogers, when he made inconvenient, though accurate, observations. So the UK was at a disadvantage in the field from the start, even though they had all-stars on the bench. Third, and by contrast, the EU's management of the Brexit process was exceptionally good. The selection of Michel Barnier as the lead negotiator was inspired. He had experience as a commissioner, deep understanding of Brussels, and an instinct for managing the member states. He recognized right away that the EU 27's biggest challenge would be staying unified, given its wide range of interests. He imposed the no dialogue until you file Article 50 notice rule right away, even though it didn't really have a treaty basis, and insisted on settlement of withdrawal terms before any discussion of future relations. The EU was so conflicted and disorganized and May was so under pressure from the hardcore leavers, she didn't even fight those early battles. We did a recent study on Brexit called After Brexit, and that study had a game theory chapter, and the way we put it was that the EU knew from the outset it was playing a zero-sum game where it could only win if Britain lost. Britain, on the other hand, wasn't sure what game it was playing and against whom. Fourth, Theresa May's political judgments and instincts were poor, which aggravated the UK's difficulties. The decision to call a snap election in the summer of 2017 to improve her parliamentary majority after denying any such intention was the worst decision she made, as it cost the Tories their majority, elevated Jeremy Corbyn in his own eyes and those of the Labour base, and greatly empowered the Ulster Unionist Party, the DUP, which had under a support arrangement, kept the Tories in party. And during the campaign, May was seen as really a wooden campaigner. And by all accounts, she also hasn't been able to make connections with her EU Council, EU Summit counterparts. All of these consequences have gravely weakened May's endgame. And yet, as we've seen in recent months, and as other leaders occasionally when standing on the edge of the abyss, Theresa May is so weak that she's strong. Her withdrawal agreement lost in January by the biggest margin of any bill in recent British parliamentary history, yet she decisively held off a leadership challenge and a vote of no confidence. Corbyn's outside the mainstream leftism and unrelated corrosive anti-Semitism problems in his party have helped May cement the no alternative position. Maggie Thatcher should have been so lucky. Finally, it's now clear to everyone that, as our study demonstrated in 2017, Britain will harm the UK significantly economically and the rest of the EU only somewhat. Banks have moved operations to the continent. Honda and Nissan have announced job cuts, and foreign direct investment has stalled. There are lots of other indicators as well. London property markets have cooled. Airbus is talking about supply chain alternatives. And this is all before a possible no-deal outcome. So what happened this week? I did a TV interview on Wednesday in which I said what was really happening was that the reality show that is Brexit has been renewed for a new season. It got a laugh, but it's really not so funny. The British were unable to muster a majority in Parliament for the withdrawal agreement, or really anything else, except a narrow majority by 3 votes that didn't want a no-deal exit. The outreach that I mentioned earlier to Labour hasn't provided any early solutions. So it fell on the EU summit to provide the exit route on Wednesday night by voting unanimously for a 6-month extension. I like to think of it as a game of chicken in which the EU saved Britain by swerving at the last minute. So what happens now? Well, one thing that will happen is that the British candidates will compete in the European Parliament election starting May 23rd, ostensibly only for a term of 4 months. That is necessary because otherwise the EP, the European Parliament, which takes office on July 1, might be legally questionable. But more importantly, with this new 6-month lease on membership, Prime Minister May will be resuming her effort to get the withdrawal agreement through. And to do that, she will need to attract either harder-line Tories who hate the backstop but may also still want to get Britain out, or Labour who favor a customs union, which is anathema to many Tories precisely because it would prevent Britain from ever negotiating its own trade agreements. Maybe the force of the recent follies or public pressure will allow one or the other side to prevail, but it's not a sure thing. If Britain does, by hook or crook, approve the withdrawal agreement, it will get to leave sooner than October 31, begin a transition period, and start negotiating the long-term trade agreement it will need for the future. So what does all this mean for business? In the short term, by which I mean the next 6 months, little will change. Britain will remain a member of the single market and apply EU's common external tariffs. But the uncertainty about the future has affected foreign investors in Britain. That will continue. Banks and other financial institutions that have been moving operations to other EU member states will likely continue to make such preparations for the day Britain may leave. And domestically in the UK, the political struggle over the form of Britain's post-membership relationship with the EU, which is really of primordial importance to the UK, will continue. It will be important for business to follow that debate. From the standpoint of U.S. business, tariffs and regulatory barriers between the U.S. and the U.K. are not likely to change very much, whether Britain adopts the EU's customs union approach, a free trade agreement approach, sometimes called Canada Plus, or a Norway single market approach. But a U.S.-UK free trade agreement, which in theory could eliminate barriers between the U.S. and the U.K. and is strongly supported, at least politically, by President Trump, could possibly improve access for services, including financial services. But it's only possible if the ardent leavers get out of the EU's customs union. Our analysis shows that such an FTA between the U.S. and the U.K. would have a positive, though not large, impact on the U.S., and in theory, more significance for the U.K. But it would impinge on the problem of open borders in Ireland, so it would be difficult to arrange under most circumstances. There would also be predictable food and other regulatory allergies to such a deal on the part of the British public, from chlorinated chickens to GMOs, so the negotiations wouldn't be easy. These concerns haven't stopped the U.S. Trade Representative's Office and the British from preliminary discussions about preparing for such an FTA, but they can only take place for real once the U.K. is out of the EU. British and American businesses also need to consider the possible economic and other implications of a no-deal crash-out scenario. That scenario has sharp economic consequences for British trade with the EU. And as press accounts have dramatized, in a no-deal scenario, the UK and the EU would be obligated to immediately put in place trade barriers and inspections on trade that now happens seamlessly. British planners have discussed waving through imports from the EU on a transitional basis, relying on manufacturers and wholesalers' declarations. The plans involve cutting duties on agricultural commodities from high EU levels to prevent a food price spike in Britain. Most importantly, in a no-deal scenario, that segment of British manufacturing that depends on just-in-time value chain, parts and components supply back and forth across the channel, would be rendered non-competitive. That is doubtless the reason the Japanese manufacturers in particular have been vocal about freezing their investment and production plans until they see what's happening. Now, our analysis shows that overall, U.S. investors in the UK are more focused on the domestic market than the sort of export platform market. So they're less at risk on that basis. But if the British domestic economy is hit badly by no deal, U.S. firms would suffer that way. And it's conceivable that port congestion and Her Majesty's customs being overwhelmed by coping with trade with the continent, clearance times for U.S. exports to the UK will be affected as well. The Brexit process is full of irony and unintended consequences. Just three of the most notable to point out. The road to Brexit began with David Cameron promising in 2013 to renegotiate the relationship. He saw this as a way to rid Tory politics of the Eurosceptic cancer. The result has been the opposite, casting Britain out of the EU and tearing the Tory party apart. An irony. For UK leavers, the economics didn't seem to matter, or could be merely assumed away in search of regained sovereignty. They called the Remainers' concerns Project Fear. But leavers have always assumed, or at least argued, that Brussels would give way on all issues because of the EU's supposed economic dependence on the British market. Political concerns, however, have been dominant on both sides of the Channel. And the Irish focused early on the preservation of no borders to movement of goods and people on the island. On their behalf, the EU insisted on the unqualified backstop unless the UK agrees to something equivalent, although no one knows quite what that might be. Yet insisting on the backstop without a time limit may well have sunk the withdrawal agreement, leading possibly to a no-deal, chaotic exit, and of course the Irish border situation would be much more acute. So what we've seen this week is only the end of the beginning, not the beginning of the end of the Brexit saga. Ahead of us will be years of negotiations, dramatic votes in Parliament and the European Council, and political turmoil, especially in Britain. One reason is that, as I mentioned at the outset, few really thought about this process before it began, and we just really don't know as much about raising trade barriers as we do about cutting them. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Charlie. Thank you for that excellent historical overview and global perspective. Next, I'm going to call upon Piers Coleman from our London office to give his view from inside the Houses of Parliament.
So firstly, good morning. Thank you for inviting me. As you say, an extraordinary date. And I had prepared some slides, but I could only prepare them a few days ago because things were changing hourly. As it happened, some of my slides are completely inappropriate now because events have moved on. So what I'd like you to do is to look at the slides and treat them as a series of bullet points which might generate conversation, as opposed to being entirely factually correct, because they're just not. And what I'd like to do, having heard Charles's really excellent and forensic analysis and appreciation, is to look a little bit more at the political history in the UK, because the divisions in the UK government and the UK Parliament, and indeed across the whole of the UK, are a reflection of the historical divisions that came to a head in the 2016 referendum. So if we look back, just before 2010, there is a deeply unpopular UK Prime Minister, Gordon Brown. He goes to a general election in 2010, and the Conservative Party, headed by David Cameron, are very confident of getting an overall majority. Much to their surprise, they don't. And they enter into a coalition government with the Lib Dems, which has not happened in the UK for decades. So the Prime Minister is much weaker than he thought he was going to be. He has an overall majority, not a strong one. Now, since the 1975 referendum in the UK, the Euroscepticism to which you referred, Charles, has been continuing and growing, and the move for a referendum had been going on for many years. Indeed, there was even a referendum party in the late 1990s, and they fought the 1997 general election. And then in the early 2000s, another political party called the UK Independence Party, known in the trade as UKIP, were formed, headed by the charismatic Nigel Farage. Nigel Farage, who regarded himself as a great, great friend of Donald Trump, and even expected to be appointed the US ambassador to the UK. Unfortunately, he was very disappointed. But he still thinks he's very good friends. There we have it. The UKIP are becoming more and more popular, and some Conservative MPs begin to think about defecting to UKIP. in between 2010 and 2015. And so we get to a stage, as you said, Charles, that David Cameron feels that he has to offer a referendum in order to silence his right-wingers who all want to defect to UKIP. And so he offers the referendum and he silences them, and he fights the 2015 general election with this time all the pollsters saying he wasn't going to win an absolute majority, we may have another coalition, and then against all the odds he actually wins an overall majority of 12, which was workable, but then he has to fulfill his promise to hold a referendum. Now, David Cameron was a sort of careless man. One of his insiders said to me, Dave was a chancer, and he didn't pay much attention to the form of the referendum, so he didn't think about the fact that voters over the age of 16 could vote instead of over the age of 18. After all, it was their future we were voting on. He didn't think about giving long-standing EU residents a vote. He didn't think about the idea that the majority shouldn't be 50%, it should be maybe 60 or 65%. He was confident of winning. Indeed, he promised to sign the notice of withdrawal from the EU the day after the referendum was held if he lost. And again, he was gambling because it was never going to happen. But he had to resign first, another British Prime Minister, to lose their job over Europe. Of course, he couldn't sign the withdrawal notice the day after the referendum because actually there was no legal authority to do that, another area in which he was careless. It needed parliamentary authority first. So when Theresa May comes into Downing Street to take his place, she discovers that the constitutional lawyer's view is that we need to go through Parliament first, and she decides she's going to fight it. And she fights it all the way to the Supreme Court, and of course she loses. So she loses her first major battle, and that already removes some of her credibility. And then, of course, it goes to Parliament, and Parliament says, well, you voted in the referendum, so of course we're going to let it go through. And by a huge majority, they authorised her to sign the notice invoking Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty in March 2017. So she did that. She then decided, she was getting pretty confident by then, that working majority of 12 that David Cameron had got was, well, wasn't great because she was going to go through some difficult political times, and Jeremy Corbyn was a rubbish leader of the Labour Party and he was never going to go anywhere. He was down in the polls. Let's have another general election because I can get a really big majority and then I can force everything through and nobody will be able to complain. It was catastrophic for Theresa May. She loses her overall majority, and she has to then reach a private agreement with the DUP, hardline unionist party of Northern Ireland, who offer their 10 seats to her under a confidence supply arrangement on terms, well, somewhere between £1 and £2 billion pounds sterling as a contribution to the economy of Northern Ireland. So Theresa May loses her second major battle, and she begins her negotiations with the EU in a not strong political position. So she then faces a next problem, which is she says to Parliament, well, of course, I've now got authority to go ahead and negotiate my withdrawal agreement, and I don't need you anymore. And Parliament says, I don't think we agree with that. We think you've got to come back and get us to approve the deal that you finally do. And she fights that, and she loses again. Her third major battle, because Parliament imposes on her a requirement that the withdrawal agreement, coupled with what's called the political declaration, have to be approved first before we can actually proceed to come out of the EU. At least the one thing that she did succeed in doing was to say that she only needed a majority in the House of Commons. She would never, ever, ever have got a majority in the House of Lords. So eventually she comes back to the House of Commons with her withdrawal agreement, and which is finalised, I think, November, December last year, for what's called the first meaningful vote. And the right wing of the Conservative Party and the DUP and the whole House get really, really het up over what they call the Irish backstop. And Charles has already explained that, so I'm not going to go into that anymore. But the fact is that suddenly a huge number of members of Parliament become very powerful unionists. and they're passionate about supporting their great friends in Northern Ireland. And if in the process it happens to me that they turn down Theresa May's agreement, well, that's, but they're doing it for entirely nationalistic reasons, and therefore they're good guys. So, of course, that's what happened. It's a funny thing, actually, that this week, when we're still talking about approving the withdrawal agreement, that the backstop is hardly mentioned at all now. So those unionists, well, they were unionists a few months ago, but, well, maybe it's not so important now. So we've had meaningful vote 1, 15th of January, lost by 230. Meaningful vote 2, 12th of March, lost by 149. Meaningful vote 3, 29th March, lost by 58. Theresa May even offers to resign to get the withdrawal agreement through if it goes through, and she still fails with that. And then we've had what are called non-binding indicative votes in the House of Commons, none of which have yet succeeded. We've had a public petition of 6 million signatures in 6 days for a revocation of the Article 15 notice. We've had acts of Parliament requiring that there be a no-deal Brexit and that Theresa May has to go and seek an extension. And the House of Commons and the UK are still totally divided. So there is Theresa May struggling to cope with a deeply divided government, unsubtle, stubborn, obstinate, lacking in any warmth. She has none of the skills that a politician needs to bind together her party, let alone the government, let alone to have proper discussions with her colleagues in the EU. Now, in passing, when I was a young lawyer, I remember being taught about what we called the separation of powers. And there we had, and I don't know if you have it in the US, Parliament and the executive or the government and the judiciary. And each is supposed to be a check on the others. So one of the difficulties that Theresa May has felt is that she, as the executive, had greater authority than anybody else. Well, the judiciary held her back when they said that she needed to go to Parliament to get authority to invoke Article 50. Parliament themselves are now checking her back, and she is so weak that actually Parliament are passing acts of Parliament where the government are told to vote against the wishes of members of Parliament and still lose. So she's in a very, very weak position. So that's my little bit of political history. And so who are the characters? Now then, with a nod to the Times of London and with a nod to Lionel Richie, what's it say? And now that we've come to the end of, I'm not going to sing, end of the rainbow, you're once, twice, 3 times a loser. And there we have Theresa May at the piano, and on her left we have, in front of her, on our left, we have Speaker Bercow, who is the one who has helped the House of Commons to reach the decisions that he wanted them to reach. We have Arlene Foster, the hardline leader of the DUP, who has been very, very influential and very, very tough in her negotiation. And then we have Jeremy Corbyn, the leader of the British Labour Party, and the totally conflicted man whose party are now saying they want a customs union, whereas he actually believes that the EU is nothing more than a capitalist plot. So where are we now? Now, there are various options here, which I listed for you. Of course, I didn't know where we were going to end up, but anyway, so I'm going to go through them in a different order. So first of all, extend the effect of Article 50 until, well, we've got those dates already. Those dates are no longer any good. So the dates we currently have to worry about, 22nd of May, 1st of June, 31st of October. 22nd of May, that's the day before the European parliamentary elections. And the Prime Minister still hopes that, she can put her withdrawal agreement back to the House of Commons for a 4th vote. Why not? And if she manages to get it through in the next month, then she'll cancel the UK taking part in the European parliamentary elections, even though everybody's now starting to campaign. This is going to be bizarre. In which case we can all come out on the 22nd, 23rd of May. No, sorry, we'd come out on the 1st of June if we fail to take part in the elections which are fixed for the 23rd of May. So the EU made it very plain. If we didn't take part in the elections on the 1st of June, we're out. No deal Brexit, out on the 1st of June. Well, the view I think most people say will probably take part in those European parliamentary elections unless Theresa May can work a miracle. And then, so the final date to come out is the 31st of October, Halloween Day, as you say, so far, because, you know, who knows, we may be back again in Brussels in October. That will be exciting. Second option, negotiate with the opposition. Oh my God, they hate each other. Theresa May and Jeremy Corbyn are as opposite as you possibly can be. They're both people lacking in any charm whatsoever. They hate the idea that they have to pretend to negotiate. But the Labour Party are setting out their stall, and Theresa May says publicly, of course, both sides need to compromise. She goes into the negotiations, she says, well, we need to compromise, but I'm not compromising on my side. So it's a bit difficult to see where they'll get anywhere. They came out of one of their first meetings last week, and the announcement from Jeremy Corbyn was that this had been useful but inconclusive. And that may be as far as we're ever going to go with them, we will see. Well, we could approve the withdrawal agreement in its original form. Always a possibility, but that would mean approving the political declaration as well. And I think that at the moment is an unlikely prospect, but MV4 is still on the horizon as a possibility. We could remain within the customs union. Now, here is a distinct possibility. It is what the Labour Party are punting for and what the Conservative Party deeply, deeply dislike and are suspicious of, but it may be the only way through. Take part in the European parliamentary elections? Yes, probably. Everybody's gearing up. The person who's gearing up most of all, you may find interesting, is Nigel Farage. Now, he dumped UKIP because UKIP went even more mad than they were before, and has set up his own party, which launched yesterday, called the Brexit Party. He says, so I have to believe him, that he'd raised £750,000 this week already. I don't know if that's true. But the purpose of taking part in those elections is so that he can send people to the European Parliament who don't want to be there. Doesn't sound entirely logical to me. We can hold a second referendum. Now, many of you may have heard of the People's Vote campaign. People's Vote campaign began in the UK just over a year ago, and that was designed to make the UK think again. That Theresa May finds that difficult. She said, but we've had one decision already. So it's all right for the country to only have one decision, but if you want to have a vote on the withdrawal agreement in the House of Commons, you keep on asking. Well, there's a funny thing. But the push for a second referendum is getting stronger. Nowadays, it's called a confirmatory ballot. And what that means is maybe we'll put the deal, whichever it is, that is finally negotiated to the country. That is a possibility. Bear in mind, it takes best part of 5 or 6 months, I would say, to legislate for and create all the structures for a referendum. So if it's going to happen, it'll only be in October, and we're running up against the 31st October date again. Oh dear. Well, maybe we'll have another extension. Why not? Next option, have a general election. Well, Theresa May was threatening that last week. She thought this was a really good idea until her pollsters came back and said, do you realise that the Conservative Party are going to be absolutely thrashed? Are you sure you want to do that? So that's not so much of an option at the moment, although the Labour Party would like it. We could revoke the notice we gave under Article 50 and pretend that none of this ever happened. There are some who would like, there are many Remainers who'd like that to happen. Is it realistic? I'm not entirely sure. The ECJ, the European Court, said that any revocation must be unconditional and unequivocal. And what that means, you can't do it just as a device to gain time. You've got to mean it. So I think that may be quite a difficult thing to do. Or you change the Prime Minister. Well, now here is, of course, something that is definite. The Prime Minister has said that she will go at the end of the first stage. We don't know when the first stage is going to be over. It may be October, it may be later. Whether she survives to October is a difficult thing. She is deeply, deeply wounded, but the trouble is that the members of her party can't decide on who will take her place. If they made a decision on who would take her place, then she would have gone already. And the leadership campaigns of half a dozen genuine candidates are already in full swing. So it may yet be Prime Minister Boris Johnson. My goodness. And I say at the end, or there's maybe another option yet, who knows. So I gave this to you because last week this was relevant. This is the letter that Theresa May wrote to Donald Tusk. And the one thing the EU Council said to her was, you've got to have a plan. You've got to come to us with a real plan. You read this letter, it's 2.5 pages long, there's no plan. Absolutely no plan at all. So, just briefly, legal issues, because obviously at KNL we've been providing a lot of advice to clients in the US and in the EU and in the UK about what to do. Very difficult to say what to do, but a lot of people have been making plans to not just be based in the UK, but to be refocused elsewhere in the EU. A lot of US clients have been only relatively recently realizing that actually that they need to take some very serious steps to protect their own interests. But hard Brexit now, the date for hard Brexit is probably the 31st of October, unless we don't fight the European parliamentary elections. So we've got a little bit of time to plan. Not a huge amount. Soft Brexit, of course, is what was originally what was going to happen during the period of the trade negotiation. And the original intention was we had a transition period to the end of December 2020. Well, if we take to October to do the first stage, then the transition period will probably be significantly longer than that. Softer Brexit, of course, means if we stay within the customs union. So heaven alone knows where that will be. But we have been providing a lot of help to clients on all those options if we possibly can. We've had, some of you may be aware, we've had an audit tool which has come out to many of our clients, which was particularly relevant in the context of a hard Brexit. And I hope we've been able to provide some really useful suggestions on those. We've had a series of calls across the world where we've had hundreds of people taking part, where we discussed the options. So finally, conclusion. The UK Prime Minister, 2 UK Prime Ministers have made some really seriously bad decisions. David Cameron, because he was careless. Theresa May, because she just got it wrong. Disastrous decisions for which she's paid really heavily, and potentially it will cost her her job. She's tried to chart a middle way, and she's ended up by pleasing nobody. The House of Commons is split 3 ways. The country is split too, but there's a sense of frustration at the political games. They don't get the Westminster bubble. And in the meantime, business is suffering. The sequence of promises, dates, broken dates, deadline dates, broken deadline dates is destabilizing for everybody. Many of our clients are concerned about the implications of a possible hard Brexit. And also they're very concerned about next few years' trade negotiations, of course, especially with a new Prime Minister. And for discussion, who could that be? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pierce. That was fascinating, just fascinating look at the political dynamic. So next, we're going to have Chris Roberts. If you all want to take a minute to grab a cup of coffee, Chris will talk about some practical business and tax and other trade implications of Brexit, and hopefully give you some advice or some assistance that you may need. Chris, do you want to go on up?
So good morning, everybody. I don't know, I'm just depressed, I think is my personal view. So I'm from the north of England originally, so I lived in a place called Hull, which was very much Brexit territory. The conversation this morning around the politics and why we got there was really interesting because, as a UK firm for KPMG, if you spoke to our partners in London, there was absolutely no way this was going to happen. But if you spoke to our partners in the regional practices, like I was, driving 60 miles each day from Leeds to Hull, I never once saw a Remain sign. Everything was Brexit, Brexit, Brexit. So when it came, it was depressing, and it was a shock for me because I got woken up at 6:45 in the morning, turned on my phone, looked at the news, and then immediately got a phone call from a client that was making an acquisition and trying to raise €3 billion to buy a business in the UK. And the question was, what do we do? Because by that point, sterling had tanked. There's some immediate issues, and I guess the immediate issues following the vote were really around Treasury. How do companies manage their exposure to volatility in the pound, before we got some certainty around, what the process was going to be and what was going to happen. So this morning I'm going to talk about, the corporate view and I guess in particular this is focused on, a no deal, but points the direction in some way towards where we might end up with the EU, hopefully at the end of 2020, most likely, further on from the end of 2020 if we actually do exit this year. So the slide up on the page at the moment, it talks about what the exposure analysis is for businesses, and this is from the perspective of a no deal over on the right-hand side to, as an acceptable deal and successful negotiation over on the left-hand side, but this is after, we've gone through that what does the future look like negotiation, which can only happen once we've formally left the EU. So there's been a lot of discussion, and I think as a whole for our clients, some are really well prepared. They've been looking at this since the referendum because they've got regulatory issues. So if I look at both the disruption, market access, legal and tariffs, so the pharmaceuticals industry has been right at the forefront of looking at what's the impact on their business, principally because a lot of them tended to license medicines in the UK. If you're licensing medicines in the UK with the UK regulator, that means they could be sold all across Europe. What would happen post-Brexit, what would happen in a hard Brexit, is you might not be able to sell that medicine in other EU member states if it was manufactured and licensed in the UK. So what does that mean? It means moving people, moving functions, perhaps duplicating, having something in the UK for UK distribution, something in the EU for EU distribution. The other industry that's been, that I guess initially took a very quick look at what they would need to do is financial services. So passporting rights, will I be able to still sell my financial products within the EU post-Brexit and vice versa? So we've seen a number of jobs move from London to the European Union. There's been a bit of a bidding war, a fight between Dublin, Frankfurt, Paris. Italy's been putting its hand up, although I don't think very many people want to go to Italy because the environment's a bit aggressive there occasionally from a tax perspective, and also Amsterdam. So the European Medicines Regulator ended up in Amsterdam. A number of jobs have gone to Dublin from the big US banks in particular, and then others split between Frankfurt and Paris. I think the reasons people aren't going to Paris are the tax regime. It's quite a high tax environment. People don't want to go there because of that. And I think Frankfurt is it's Frankfurt, and it doesn't have the same draw as London. So, it's been, I think, difficult conversations have been had within business around who do we move and how. The businesses that were perhaps slower to the mark are, traditional manufacturers. Automotive was a bit slow, but we've seen that speed up, particularly in the last 12 months or so. So if you look at, tax and tariffs, if we end up with a cliff edge or a mitigated no deal and we revert to World Trade Organization regime, where do you get where do your car parts come from? Sometimes car parts will cross the border 2 or 3 times before they end up in a finished car. When you have tariffs on each of those moves, if there's a queue at Dover of 45 miles from London of traffic, how do you get your goods across to meet just-in-time rules? You'd have the same. We've talked a lot about the disruption on the UK side. There'll be disruption on the continent as well. The French in particular are not shy about causing delays at the border in Calais. If anybody's gone on summer holidays to France, like I have, and the Netherlands as well is another area which is a key port into the UK. So how do businesses manage that supply chain? How do they deal with that disruption? So from an automotive perspective, I had conversations with clients around, do you move to a different port? Do you start stock building in the UK? How do you manage that risk to make sure you can meet your customers' demands? From a pharmaceutical perspective, what if your medicine has a short shelf life? It needs to stay refrigerated. It lasts 2 days once you've made it. Can you actually get it into the UK? The NHS has had conversations with a number of their suppliers or the key suppliers they brought into a room and basically said, if you can't provide us with the medicines, then it's your problem. It's not our problem, and it'd be your fault if people die because of that. It won't be ours. So very clearly putting the onus back on business, which I think came as quite a shock, particularly to some of my clients that were in the room. So clients have been stock building, so moving from maybe 2 months worth of stock to 9 months in one example. So the working capital cost, the funding cost of doing that is absolutely enormous. And I think from a UK economy perspective, that's probably quite good because it means that people are spending money, producing things, manufacturing things, and they're ready for an exit from the European Union. So it's probably kept the economy going. But we're probably going to have a number of those as we decide we're going to leave, and then we agree a timetable again, and then we decide we're going to leave again. So I think at some point it will come to a head. The fourth one on the slide there is the people slide. The people consequences. So, cliff edge, restricted migration, UK less favourable. I've seen a number of clients have real problems with this already, not because there are any rules in place that say an EU national can't come and work in the UK, but simply the value of the pound's dropped 20% against the euro since the vote. So particularly in the manufacturing north, in the food industry, in the agricultural industry, it relies very heavily on EU migrants coming in and working. So, they haven't come back to the UK after Christmas. They've gone and got jobs in Germany or France or elsewhere because the pound's just worth a lot less. And also, they don't feel welcome. If you're reading in the newspaper all the time around, negative stories around immigrants into the UK, stealing our jobs, etc., it's just not a welcoming environment to be in. So we've been helping a number of our clients with the messaging they can give to employees. So, we do love you, we want you to stay here. This is what you need to do to get registered to be able to stay here post-Brexit. It's kind of help them put their mind at ease around that. Now, we haven't seen many clients completely underwrite, the risk of employees leaving, so paying for, full citizenship, in the UK. But we have seen, a number of clients looking to, facilitate, make things easier for their employees to stay. And when you're in a financial services industry and everybody's well paid, companies are willing to pay, a lot of money to get certainty for their employee base. When you're in food manufacturing and you've got 9,000 people, cutting up pork in a factory in East Yorkshire, the cost of doing that on an individual basis is absolutely enormous and prohibitive, but you need those people to stay because you can't get locals to do those jobs. So that, that is a huge issue. And what the future looks like is a huge issue for those industries as well. So when we look at, food manufacturing in particular, the salaries tend to be low. Agricultural salaries tend to be quite low. If you look at the proposed immigration rules that the government's talking about bringing in, well, they're looking at a floor on annual earnings, which is a relatively high number. They're looking at treating EU nationals exactly the same as nationals from outside of the EU. So, to look at some of the reasons for the vote, people stealing our jobs, coming to the UK from, the EU and stealing our jobs, but equally coming to the UK from outside of the EU and stealing our jobs. The irony is that we'll probably end up with more non-EU migrants to the UK than we had before. And then the last one is an interesting one, particularly because it comes out of what happens in terms of an exit deal. So if your financial system is based on having to charge VAT at a certain rate, dealing with tariffs at a certain rate, treating exports to the EU as different to exports from outside the EU, being able to switch in the event of a no deal, or even being able to switch longer term, depending on where we end up, to change your IT system to align to a new set of regulations and rules is something that takes a very long time to do. We've had a 2-year period that we've gone past. A lot of businesses would struggle to change their IT system within a 2-year period, given some of the IT projects that I've been involved with. We Charles talked briefly about the proposed unilateral measures in the event of a no deal. And so we've got the intention is to slash tariffs in the event of a no deal to 0% on most goods, with about 13% still being subjected to tariffs. So beef, lamb, pork and poultry and some dairy products in order to protect UK farmers from cheap imports. A number of tariffs on finished vehicles to protect the automotive sector. And then we've also got ceramics, fertiliser and fuel where tariffs protect UK producers against unfair practices like dumping, etc. And then also goods like bananas, cane sugar and certain types of fish where the UK has tariffs to give preferential access to developing countries. So, I think it's good that we won't end up with tariffs on a lot of products. From a UK perspective going forward, and our ability to negotiate trade deals, if we're willing to give all of this away, even if it's only for a temporary time, what does it mean for our trade negotiation strategy going forward? Because we've already, I guess, let ourselves down and given the house away by saying that we're willing to get rid of the tariffs to protect our economy. And if it doesn't have that big of an impact, then going into negotiation with the US, where agriculture in particular is an area where the UK would want to protect both UK farmers, but also UK consumers. So we talked about chlorinated chicken. That is a huge issue in the UK. Whether it's right or wrong, it's a massive problem in the press, in particular. The fact that that we potentially get chlorinated chicken in the UK. We prefer our own cows to be mad and protect our farmers from hormonal beef. And that type of thing, then let products that we consider to potentially be unsafe. The UK Republic of Ireland border. So what the government has said is there'd be no new checks at that border, and tariffs will be payable on goods moving from the EU into the rest of the UK via Northern Ireland. Now, how in practice that will be policed is quite controversial. Number one, the EU say that it would be illegal. Two, under the Good Friday Agreement, there can be no physical infrastructure on the border. So how do we maintain the integrity of the Good Friday Agreement and protect the single market for the EU? So I've talked briefly about sectors that are impacted. Every sector is impacted by the industry, by our leaving of the EU, but in different ways. So if you look at customs and duties, it's aerospace and defence, it's automotive that are impacted the most, and that's because they rely on heavily integrated cross-EU supply chains, so goods moving in and out of the UK and into the UK and back out into the EU again. So being able to maintain some form of customs arrangement, is absolutely key for those industries, at least in the short term, as we go through to agree the deal. And from a people perspective, it's agriculture, retail and consumer markets, and hospitality and leisure. So if anybody's been to London and got into a Costa Coffee or a Starbucks, chances are you're being served by some young European that's over here working for free. How do they get into the UK going forward? Who's going to change the beds in the hotels? Who's going to make the latte for you? From a retail and consumer markets perspective, an agricultural perspective, the temporary workers that come in to pick I'm going to pick strawberries, although we've not got a great strawberry industry. Who's going to do that? How are they going to get those people in going forward? And then finally, from a regulatory perspective, financial services, life sciences are the most hit because they simply won't be able to do business going forward. Chemicals is one of my clients is a big chemicals producer. And at the moment, we have a regulation called REACH within Europe that allows them to sell chemicals within Europe that are manufactured in the UK. How do they do that going forward is a challenge. So they're looking at changing their supply chain, making the legal manufacturer a different entity. And all of these have a tax impact. So when you start to look at, do I move part of my business from the UK to Dublin? Do I move manufacturing of my medicines from the UK to the Netherlands, as an example? We need to consider from a UK perspective, what is that? Have we got value moving from the UK out of the UK tax net into the EU? Does that give you an upfront tax charge in the UK? How do you manage that, and how do you get relief for that cost, in the member state that you're going to? So, companies that have moved have been, trying to carefully manage that process to put enough substance in those territories to meet the regulatory requirement, but while balancing the tax costs associated with that. So we've forgotten Hawaii, and Alaska, actually, from this map. So, 48 states. So thinking about your supply chain, so if you currently ship directly from if you feed the UK markets or the European markets, directly from the US, then things should continue, as they are. if you're selling directly into a UK customer from here, or you're selling directly into a French customer or a German customer from here, expectation is that that wouldn't change, at least in the short term. Whereas if you're using the UK as your hub, or you're using Europe as your hub for supplying the UK, then you need to think about what is the impact on your supply chain. So this is a real issue for Japanese manufacturers, probably more than US manufacturers. So a lot of Japanese industry was, I guess, invited to the UK in the 80s by Margaret Thatcher, with the kind of the promise that we'd always stay within the EU. We've negotiated a great deal in terms of our budget rebate, et cetera, et cetera. A number of carve-outs from working time directives, and now we've gone and left. So the Japanese, in particular, are quite annoyed by what we've done, and that we've seen that come through. It may or may not be directly related to Brexit, but by cutting manufacturing in the UK in terms of Honda, Nissan no longer looking to produce a new car in the UK, the Qashqai is no longer going to be sold within Europe. So a number of issues coming to the fore. So if your UK company is central to your supply chain, you need to think carefully about, well, what does a no-deal Brexit mean? It will be very bad, I would have thought. But equally, what does the future look like? And do I need to change the way my supply chain works to minimise, perhaps not duties if we end up in a customs union with the European Union, but particularly in terms of transport and logistics? What does it do to my supply chain and my working capital requirements? So I've talked to some of this. So it doesn't affect all sectors equally, so you need to think carefully about what your business is. So those rooted businesses, and these are, as Charles mentioned, the research that the RAND Corporation's done, these are businesses that are in the UK that supply the UK domestic market. They have to be in the UK because that's where their customers are. So whether it's, social care, UK transport, UK domestic retailers, and hotels, etc., that rely on the UK industry, well, there's probably not a great deal they can do about it. Their customers are still going to be in the UK. They're still going to need to be there. So it's how do you manage some of the probably the people aspects of us coming out of the EU the most for those businesses. The interconnected businesses, they have a large domestic footprint, but they're part of an integrated supply chain. So again, what do they need to do? Can they leave everything the same? Will there be a cost or an issue for them? Or do they need to start moving things into the EU to protect themselves in the event of a no-deal Brexit? And, interestingly, I don't know if any of you have had, letters from customers. So particularly in the auto industry, we've seen this. So the big auto manufacturers writing to their suppliers saying, what's your Brexit readiness plan? If you turn around and say, well, I haven't got one, that's likely to be problematic for you. So thinking about, what is my Brexit readiness plan? What's the impact on my suppliers of a no-deal Brexit, not just my position? And looking backwards through your supply chain to say, well, we know that it's potential duty impact, it's a potential, logistics time impact on us, and there's an element of people as well, because we rely on either EU nationals within our factories, or we've got key people within our UK organisation that are EU nationals that we want to protect. And then finally, the mobile businesses. So we've not heard a great deal about this today, but the UK is a great place to do business. It doesn't sound like it at the moment, but we do have, one of the lowest tax rates within the G20. Helpfully, we speak English. Some of us not very well, but we do speak English. And then London, is a place that people want to live. It is a place that draws in people from across the world. It is a very international city. So, a number of my clients where we've done, restructurings with them where they've been told, you have to move to Switzerland or you have to move to Luxembourg. Nobody really wants to live in Luxembourg. Maybe, unless you're from Luxembourg, then it's lovely. And equally Switzerland, it's a lifestyle choice, but it doesn't fit for everybody. Whereas London, there's things going on, there's lots of international schools. It's a place that people want to do business, and that's the reason they're there. But they don't need to be there. So if you're a business in gaming, entertainment, etc., that doesn't need to be in London, well, where do you need to be to make sure you can still attract that talent? Is London still the right answer? And that really depends on where we end up with on immigration. So what actions are businesses taking in that context? So they are mapping the supply chain, so looking at where my potential costs are, can I mitigate or manage those? Do I change to domestic suppliers? What's the cost of doing that? Understanding the tax and tariff exposure. So KPMG has developed a tool that looks at imports and exports within your UK business and can tell you what the potential tax and tariff implications of a no-deal Brexit, and that will develop as we get to a deal as well. So you can understand, well, do I need to change and how would I mitigate that cost? Supplier and customer contracts. This is more of a legal issue, but is driven off partly driven off the tax. So if you have tax and tariff costs arising as a result of Brexit, what do your contracts with customers say? Whose cost is that? And if your supplier's got a tax cost that they try to pass on to you, is that a cost to you within your contract or not? I advise on a number of contracts with clients where they're transacting cross-border, and they'll include gross-up clauses, which will essentially say that if you need to pay me 1,000 for this product, I expect 1,000. If there's a new withholding tax cost, or if there's some kind of indirect tax cost or a duty cost as a result of us leaving the EU, I still expect you to pay me 1,000, and you have to bear that cost. So how do you manage that within your contracts? The pre-existing contracts and contracts going forward. Corporate and entity structure. So this is an issue where you have UK might be the holding company for Europe, and you have Germany under the UK, Italy under the UK. If we leave the EU with no deal, then we fall outside of the EU directives for withholding tax on dividend payments up or on interest payments between those parties. So can you restructure out of that early? That's difficult to do, but it is a possibility to look at. So how does your corporate structure work, and is it impacted by Brexit? And then finally, people impact and engagement. So how do you keep your people happy? How do you show them that they're loved? I mean, we've got, I think, 900 EU nationals in our UK firms, so we've been engaging with them on an individual and collective basis to try and help them through the mess that's coming out of the government. And then obviously there's a number of other things on there, but they are probably longer term issues depending on where we get to with negotiations. So this is what we're saying to clients. So triage your Brexit decisions based on a potential no deal scenario. I think you should still be prepared for that. Our view as a firm is that that's probably going to happen by accident rather than by design. So this brinkmanship, I think an extension of the exit to the 31st of October does not guarantee a deal next month. I think if anything from our perspective, it probably will lengthen the time it will take towards the end of October. I know we've got the European elections in the middle, but if you are somebody who voted against Theresa May's deal for the first 3 times, well, you've got until October now to get something that you want. Why would you vote? There's no pressure really on you as a parliamentarian to vote for that deal. So what are the no regret things? So, the positive, the things that were kind of on the to-do list anyway, in terms of your business, why not do them if they give you protection from a no-deal Brexit? Tactical, so what are some useful mitigation for scenarios that may provide a tactical competitive advantage? So this is if you're written to by, the automotive manufacturer, the car manufacturer, saying, what's your Brexit readiness plan? If you're the business that has one of those and your competitors don't, then that would give you a competitive advantage. The irreversible and the run risk are things that you're probably not going to do until the last minute, until you've actually got to do them, because there is a cost to doing that. And then running the risk is kind of self-insuring that risk. So we know there's a cost, we've identified the cost, but the cost of mitigating that is too high. So, we're going to run the risk of a no-deal Brexit. This is a busy slide, so hopefully you'll get it afterwards, but it kind of goes through some of the key questions you might ask yourself when you're going through that assessment process. So, from a market perspective, what will this mean for your markets going forward? Will EU-UK trade reduce? from your organisational governance structure, what will change, operational technology and people and culture are the key ones on there. But these are some of the questions that boards should be asking themselves. We've seen some clients that are just, we're not doing anything at all. Our advice is that shouldn't be where you're at, because you don't want to get a question from your shareholders, from your investors around, well, what is your Brexit readiness plan? What is the impact on your business? If you're doing M&A, you're looking at UK acquisitions, or you're looking at European acquisitions, what's the Brexit impact on that business, on that supply chain? You should be looking at that and considering it. This is a risk that should be on your risk register. It should have probably, I would say, a low risk, maybe medium risk of a catastrophic exit, and that would have a high impact. You just manage it like every other risk, but you need to understand, well, what is the impact on your business? That's it. Well, say that's it. It'll carry on. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Chris, for that excellent practical advice. Now we're going to move into the interactive portion of the program. And if our audiovisual program works here, we're going to hear from one of our clients at a company called NEP, which is headquartered in Pittsburgh, but has substantial operations in both the UK and in Europe. And David Ledbetter, who's there, is going to be the first of our folks here in the audience that we'd like to hear from. Those of you in the audience obviously come from the business world, different industry and business sectors, and we want to hear your comments and perspectives and issues, and also to pose questions to our panel of experts, maybe to get some extra degree of clarity or information that might help you in your day-to-day operations. So, David, are you there? I think we can see you here in Pittsburgh. Can you see us?
Hi there. Yes, I can see you. Can you hear me?
Yes, absolutely.
Excellent. Wow.
Why don't you tell the audience who you are, tell them a little bit about your company and what issues you're facing as a result of Brexit.
Sure, sounds good. Look, thanks very much, and thanks to Charles and Pierce and Chris. Those three very good presentations, very useful. My name's David Ledbetter. I'm the UK Head of Legal at NEP, which is a outside broadcasting, live event and media technology company in 24 countries in the world, headquartered in Pittsburgh. So I can talk briefly about, from a UK perspective, operationally, some of the issues that we're seeing and what we're doing in terms of preparation. So if I quickly run through those, and then maybe I've got a question at the end for the panel. I think Charles touched on the kind of four different freedoms, if you like, in terms of services, goods, people, and capital. I think the nature of our business is that we are probably dependent on all of those largely. We do a lot of our business in the EU. Certainly our live event business, about 45% of our business is in the EU. We provide goods and services. So obviously, running through the kind of issues first that we're facing as a result of Brexit, we've got our right to provide services, and whether or not in future we'll be treated as a third country by various member states where we currently enjoy the right to provide those services. We've got goods. We move expensive equipment across the border. Most days, I think at the moment, I had a quick look at our check, and we've got trucks currently going through Europe for an event in Russia, some in Malta, some in Italy, and some in Monte Carlo. We obviously have an issue there potentially with physical delays at the border, but also with temporary import and export licenses, potentially again in a no-deal scenario being a kind of third-party country risk. We have the free movement of people or workers issue. Obviously those people have to travel across the EU to provide those services. And we have a number of our staff, much like Chris was saying, who are EU nationals. And then outside those, we've got issues such as, will driving licenses be valid in a no-deal scenario? What do we need to change in our contracts, and to the extent we do, does that create a competitive disadvantage if we're seeking, for example, to put force majeure clauses in our contract? Insurance, is our kit still insured? Do we have the correct cover there? And then, as you were touching on, kind of tax consequences. And a lot of those, really, in terms of moving on to preparation and what we do, can be split between the kind of short-term planning of a no-deal scenario. As you mentioned, this keeps slipping, and it's something that as we get closer to a no deal, there's a kind of last minute preparation. There's certain issues you can do to try and mitigate that. So, for example, as I mentioned, knowing where your people, where your equipment is, and making sure that the individuals, for example, have got sufficient time on their passports to get home in the event of a no-deal scenario. Making sure that your staff, who are EU nationals, have, where possible, applied for settled status. Making sure that your insurance arrangements are in place. Making sure that your driving licence is valid in the EU. But I think, and Chris put it quite well, a lot of the issues we face in the industry are really irreversible ones, so it's quite hard within the current uncertainty. And I think probably a lot of the elements of these presentations have been fairly similar for the last couple of years. No one's quite sure what's going to happen. And the decisions that you take to mitigate are relatively irreversible. So, for example, increasing the resource in terms of leases and warehouse space in the EU to service those clients, people in the EU, contracts being drawn from entities in the EU. A lot of these decisions are quite irreversible. So they're ones that you can't take without a good degree of certainty that they're necessary, which makes it very difficult, as I think the panel were touching on. There is only so much you can do for a no-deal scenario in terms of planning. You can be prepared, but a lot of the decisions that you'll find yourself considering are relatively irreversible. So I guess that's kind of operationally where we are at the UK. Again, sharing Chris's depression over here. And I guess the kind of question is, it looks, to the extent anyone can predict this, and I don't think anyone can, but it looks like there's a kind of increased possibility, and no more than that, but an increased possibility of a potential customs union. And I guess question for the panel, to what extent, if we do end up in a customs union scenario, and again, it's anyone's guess if that's a kind of Turkey-style customs union or more of a kind of Norway-Switzerland style, to what extent do you think that would mitigate the type of issues that I've just discussed there as a company that we're facing on a kind of operational level?
Okay, thank you, David. Charlie, do you want to start off on that one?
Yeah, well, thank you very much. I think that's the valid question to ask these days, because customs union prospects have probably increased. The short answer is that depends on the terms of the customs union. A Turkey-style customs union, the Turks are obligated to apply common external tariffs on industrial goods. It doesn't cover agriculture at all, and it doesn't cover services. And so for all intents and purposes, if you're in the services business, you're just a third country supplier to the UK and have that situation. If you're in industrial products, you do face border delays. The UK will have much better negotiating leverage with the EU if it gets its act together in a customs union. But the terms and conditions of a customs union won't be known for years, because it will take that long to put them in place and negotiate them all. And there will be really important opposition to a customs union from the hard side of the Brexit debate in the Tory party, who will see a customs union as, however practical for Northern Ireland, as giving up the dream, shall we say, of Singapore of the Atlantic and free trade agreements with the U.S. and Australia and Japan and everyone else. But the short answer is it will really, being in a customs union, as helpful as it might be from a tariff standpoint, there will be no tariffs between the EU and the UK, doesn't necessarily resolve all the other regulatory issues and inspection issues that one would face moving product back and forth across the channel.
Any other comments on that question, the customs union? And Pierce, I am sort of curious why the Labour Party is so enamored with a customs union, albeit much to the chagrin of the Conservatives.
Anything to be different to the Conservatives, I think, partly. And of course, the Labour Party are as split as the Conservative Party are split, and that makes it more difficult because those Labour MPs who are actually pro-leave, whom Jeremy Corbyn has been trying to protect, won't want a customs union either. I think the thing, firstly, David, I would endorse everything that Charles says. I would say that from a political point of view, you have to bear in mind the fact that the political climate will change not necessarily to your advantage. There will be a general election or two before a customs union has been finally resolved, and knowing the antipathy to the Europeans across a lot of the UK, it may well be not to our advantage by the time we've changed the colour of the UK Parliament. So I wouldn't place too much weight on it if I were you. And one thing I did want to say following Chris's excellent presentation was in talking about contracts, and David, you also referred to those, it is absolutely vital for those who are outside the UK and inside to review all their contracts to see where they stand. And that means existing contracts to see to what extent they can get out if they're hammered by pricing or currency changes or tax difficulties, or to reprice. And from David's perspective, where you're probably issuing new contracts on a fairly regular basis, to be reviewing the form of the contract you're going to be using. And sadly, I think that the move that you are making to create greater space within the EU is an irreversible move.
Charlie, did you want to add something?
Yeah, just one other thought that I had. To answer your question, why is labor for a customs union? Pierce is completely right. It's partially just to drive the Tories crazy. But to the extent that there is rationale to it, a customs union would reduce the impact on manufacturing, which is important to labor members because it will guarantee that there is continuity, at least in duty-free access into the continent. But the customs union does not presuppose any free movement of labor. And for labor in Hull and in the Northeast, they are concerned about Romanians and Bulgarians and other EU member countries taking advantage of that free movement of labor. So it's kind of a middle ground, and it keeps the party together. From Corbyn's standpoint, it keeps the party together. The parts of there are real Leave constituencies that are labor, represented by labor MPs. And so they have to have something that is a Brexit, but is different than the Tory Brexit and is less associated with a crash and jobs out, but also delivers the restrictions on the other EU citizens moving to the UK. So from all of those standpoints, I think that they've landed on customs union after actually several years of being very unspecific about what they wanted at all, because it was a middle ground for them.
Excellent, thanks. Let's take questions from the audience here in attendance. We had some that were submitted in advance. The folks here, anybody want to start us off? No raise of hands. Let me ask a couple. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, sir. And we've got a microphone here so everybody can hear you.
So maybe the panel can vote on this. But what are the chances that they're going to have another referendum? I heard everyone talk about the possibility, but no one gave a prognostication about what the chances are.
They're better than they were a year ago. The so-called People's Vote campaign has had its ups and downs, and it's certainly not at all a sure thing. But what Labour is saying in its negotiations with the Tories is that there should be a deal worked out, and it should be subjected to the public for a confirmatory vote. And one of the things that I thought increased the chances of a new referendum was when Labour started changing the way they talked about it. As I said before, they have a lot of Leave constituencies, so it's delicate for them. But they hit on this idea that if you do if a union does a contract with an employer, typically what happens is that the union authorizes or requests a renegotiation of the contract, or the contract expires, and they negotiate a new deal, and typically that deal is put to the vote to the membership for a vote. And they started talking about a new referendum, not as a new referendum, which can be seen among their Leave voters as anti-democratic, but a confirmatory vote, which is like we've seen now the contract and we're now going to agree to it. And that, I think, makes it somewhat more likely. but it has not. In the indicative votes that happened in March, it did not come close to getting a majority. And the polls show that even if there were a confirmatory vote or a referendum, unless there was a very serious public information and campaign on the part of say, the Remain of some fashion, it might lose. Strangely enough, given all the soap opera and all the difficulties that are clear with Brexit, the Leave proportion of the population hasn't changed a lot.
Let me ask a follow-up question, because coincidentally, Tony Blair was on one of the American morning news shows and was asked by one of the American journalists, and maybe this is just American naivete, but is there anything that the European Union could do to change its rules, regulations, procedures that Britain finds so objectionable, or at least a majority of Britain residents find so objectionable, such that it could persuade a majority of those in the UK to vote in favor of remaining as part of the EU? Is that even a realistic scenario?
I thought so.
I'm sorry. Pierce.
Blair, of course, is known to be a very keen Remainer.
Right.
And therefore, he doesn't necessarily come at this from a balanced viewpoint. The vote in the indicative votes in the House of Commons, the first indicative vote on a second referendum failed miserably. The second indicative vote, which was, I think, the week before last, failed only by 21 votes, with the government, they either abstained or voted against because they were told to. So were there a free vote in the House of Commons, there may well be a desire for a second referendum. You have to bear in mind the fact that Theresa May, quite rightly, is very suspicious of those calling for a referendum, because those calling for a referendum say, we just want the British people to have another think about it. What they really mean is they want to remain. And the huge agenda behind most of them is actually remain, rather than, this is a route to getting, to remain. And I think that everybody is very suspicious of that. But I think the momentum is moving that way, and I think the Labour Party suggestion that it be a confirmatory ballot may be the right way. The big question, though, will be, what is the question?
I was just going to add to that on what is the question. Is it this deal or no deal and we're out, or is it this deal or we stay in? We had 50.
Just flat Remain versus Leave as the original one.
It's exactly the same as the original one, or
Well, the original one obviously was flawed.
The answer is no. The answer to that question is no.
Now that the voters can be informed of what it means.
yeah, I think the issue is that the voters knew what they were voting for. The people who voted out would say, well, I knew what I was voting for. I was voting for bendy bananas. I was voting for, no foreign immigration. I was voting against, as a protest vote, if you like. But, the people felt distance from Westminster, which was in their own country, never mind people who spoke with a French accent in Brussels. They were a million miles away, and there was no direct line drawn between what they did and their economic prosperity. It was just a cost. It was just admin. It was just red tape. It was, rule Britannia. We can, we did it before. We can do it again. So I don't think there will be another in-out referendum. But we'll see, without a change in leadership.
Questions? Jean-Pierre Coulet, who is the representative, the honorary consul from the government of France here in Pittsburgh. So it'll be
Sorry. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it's my understanding that there is a heavy, I should call penalty, agreed to pay by the UK to European Union. And is that true? I think we are talking about something like $50 billion or something.
Yes, it's 39 billion sterling, so it's about $50 billion.
All right, and And the European Union has already put that in their budget for 2020 or 21 or whenever.
It's a little bit more complicated. Well, first of all, the settlement, the financial settlement, objectively is, first of all, the British complying with decisions that they've made in previous budgets to fund things forward. Some distribution of the pension obligations of employees that joined the EU over the past 50 years. And the UK was a member, and then the way they fund pensions on a current basis, so they have to fund them out to for as long as the former commission staffers live. And then there are assets. Some of the assets are loans that have been made to member states in Ukraine and other countries where the UK has a share of those assets, and so those are credited against debits, which might be obligations. So we promised the Romanians will build a highway, and that means you have to bear a share. So that the overall settlement started at 60 billion euros, and the British knocked it down a little bit, but not very much. And as I mentioned in the outset, one of the things that Barnier insisted on was that part, the financial settlement, be resolved before there was any talk of a future relationship. And the British, because they'd already invoked Article 50 and were facing a deadline, just swallowed it and went ahead with it. It's 39 billion sterling, but it's paid as the obligations are accrued. So there's a 7 billion sterling payment that's due this quarter. I'm not sure exactly the date, but it's this quarter, and then there's another comparable payment sort of later in the year, and two in 2020. And then that's if the withdrawal agreement was put in place. But the withdrawal agreement wasn't put in place. The British haven't got an obligation to pay it. One of the early decisions the government's going to have to make is, so the Article 50 has been extended. They are still members. They still have the obligation, like other members, to pay currently the kinds of things that they pay, which, they rebate they have a lot of different payments that they make to Brussels and receive back. And those will continue unchanged from now until the end of October, or should continue unchanged now until the end of October. And as a technical matter, if the UK agrees to the withdrawal agreement in May, maybe, if suddenly Mrs. May can get a majority to vote for the deal, the actual details of the financial arrangements will have to be changed a little bit to cover the fact that was from March 29 forward, and they actually were members until that time. But that's a technical part.
Thank you very much. I have a quick question, different. I have not heard much the word Scotland today. What happened to Scotland?
Scotland is still there. Scotland voted, of course, to remain, and they're pretty cross about being ignored. They're also very concerned about their ability to have another referendum about independence. And then the question for them is, if that referendum is different to the previous one, whether or not they'll be allowed automatically back into the EU. I think the view there is that cannot happen because it will encourage other EU states who are at risk of splintering from going through the same exercise, and I don't think anybody wants to encourage that. But the answer to your question is Scotland is still there, they're just being ignored.
Well, given the question of Scotland was brought up, do you think that it was dangerous to set the precedent of having the referendum? Because they did, set the precedent of having the referendum in Scotland. So do you think that potentially that could lead to another referendum to leave the UK?
Well, was it Piers you said that David Cameron was careless, or what was the
careless? He was
careless.
A chancer.
He's a chancer. Yes, he took a chance in agreeing to the referendum in Scotland in the first place. in 2011, I think it was, and with the hard work of Gordon Brown, actually, they won, and that was a lucky one. But having said yes to a referendum for Scotland once, yes, whether it remains part of the United Kingdom, it would be hard for a future British government to say no if the Scots made a informed and politically supported request. But the Scottish Nationalist Party that is actually in government in Edinburgh has not made such a request yet, and waiting for this all to play out and see what the consequences are politically in Scotland. So it's not necessarily a sure thing. I think it just would be hard for London to say no if there were the circumstances in which the Scots wanted to replay the referendum, since they have themselves replayed the 1975 referendum on the EU.
There will be another referendum on Scotland at some stage. I think that the Scottish Nationalist Party know that it will be their last throw of the dice. In other words, they can't have one in 2 years' time and then one another 5 years after that. They realise they've got to choose the best time. And so they're economically not strong at the moment. Oil has been a disaster. The Scottish banks have not done very well. So it's not a great time for them. And the Scottish Nationalists themselves have peaked and are on the way down. So politically it's difficult. But I'd have thought that now is not the right time. There will, I'm sure, be a chance for another one, but not quite yet.
I would add that paradoxically, a no-deal scenario with a crash out, which would be the worst for the UK economy, would make it more likely that the Scots would have the political conditions that they might feel to go again to the well and try a referendum, because south of the border in England things are really bad. Gives them a good argument for why we should get back in the EU, but it'll be several years out.
And I think my understanding of getting back into the EU is that all of the other member states would have to agree. I think for Scotland to accede back
on all accessions, it's unanimous.
And you look at Spain, Spain would never agree because they'll lose Catalonia.
Well, I mean, we know how much Scotland loves England historically, but would England even allow them to leave in the first place, or would that just be ignored as well?
I think it'd be very difficult for a British Prime Minister to ignore a valid request for another referendum. I think politically that they would have to accept it. But I think the Scottish would need to consider, well, when is the right time, and actually what are we leaving for? Because if we leave the UK to join the EU, well, we probably won't be allowed in the EU, at least not immediately. So what is it we're sailing for that's better?
I think the view from the EU is that they'd have to go to the back of the queue, and that may take a bit of time. The other thing to bear in mind about the last Scottish referendum was that 16-year-olds were allowed to vote, and that was hugely important to the Scots. And of course, if we have different rules for referendums between Scotland and the UK, it creates other issues, and I'm hoping that we will be a bit more attentive to what the rules are for referendums in the future.
There's a question in the back.
Yes, thank you. If they do go down the path of withdrawal agreement, what would be some of the key trade agreements the UK would need to negotiate, and what's the time frame for those negotiations?
The first thing that the UK needs to do is, and actually Liam Fox, who's the minister in charge of international trade, promised blithely that he would have it in place. There are 40 free trade agreements that the EU has with other countries, Korea and Japan, Canada, countries like that, and their first priority would probably be to get those in place. And they, depending on the circumstances, if they were to agree to a withdrawal agreement with a view toward negotiating a customs union, it would be relatively easy. If they were negotiating as they have in the existing Theresa May deal, the political declaration envisions a free trade agreement as a future, despite the problems that has with Ireland. partners, the EU customs union partners, might be a little bit reluctant to roll over the customs union agreements with the UK on the basis of the terms that the EU has until they see what the EU's arrangements with the UK would be for kind of complicated rule of origin type reasons. So we'd have to see. I think politically, in the event that they do get a withdrawal agreement done, even though they will try and recreate all these free trade agreements, they will want to start a new one with the U.S. administration, largely because they think that the White House is very positive to it and that it could be a big success or early success in that environment, or at least progress towards it could be an early success. I personally think that it's a lot harder than they think it's going to be because of the chlorinated chicken and a lot of the other issues that would emerge immediately. But I think that they will want to have that process in place. But as an economic matter, if they don't roll the 40 free trade agreements, they're going to suffer market access relative to their competitors in those other 40 markets, because they will immediately be discriminated. The one with the U.S. doesn't. Their market access relative to German competitors in the U.S. doesn't change on the day of their withdrawal from the EU, because they still face the same U.S. tariff levels.
Chris, did you want to address that?
I mean, I think that answers the question. I think just going back to one of the earlier questions around customs duty, customs unions and free trade agreements and market access, there are things that you can do to avoid some of the logistical problems. So authorised economic operator, think of it like the TSA pre-check line or Clear, if anybody's ever gone through an airport in this country. You don't have to take your shoes off. There's a slightly smaller queue. That's what authorised economic operator gets you. So that is something you should be considering whether or not you should get that, both in the UK and also in the EU. It's kind of like a trusted trader type arrangement. Because don't expect that to be something that you can apply for today and get in a couple of weeks. It tends to be a six month process.
Robert.
Thank you. I'd be interested to know, by a show of hands from the audience, who has a Brexit plan in place already.
Got a couple up here in front now. And I know these are the folks from Federated who are a regulated industry, so they have to have one in place.
and maybe comment from the panel, what level have you seen a Brexit plan in place in the United States, generally speaking?
I have been very taken by the lack of planning, which I have found really surprising. And I was contacted by the GC of a large Michigan company 10 days ago, and this is a seriously large organization, and the question was, what is this Brexit? No, I think another illustration is we've been having these monthly calls, which were expressed to be global calls for clients. And I would say we would regularly have a couple of hundred in the calls. They spiked very, very quickly a couple of months ago to 400 or 500. And virtually all of those taking part were from the US. So the very strong message I get from that is that it has really only hit the US consciousness this year.
I would say, the RAND Corporation, in addition to research and analysis, is also a bit of a business. We're a nonprofit. We get philanthropic contributions to support some of our research, including the Brexit study that I mentioned. But we are also in the business of doing work for governments, like KPMG, in particular, on policy problems that they have. And we have an office with 100 people in the UK. RAND Europe is based in Cambridge. And we had a branch office of RAND Europe UK in Brussels for over 10 years. And that office booked basically a third of our revenue from EU institutions, mainly from EU, also Sweden and some other countries, but mainly EU institutions, the European Commission and the Parliament, the European Defence Agency. And we made a decision in 2017 that we would incorporate the Belgian branch office as a Belgian nonprofit. And it actually took a lot longer than I thought it was going to be, because we had to get a royal decree from the King of Belgium. But we did it, and we put it in place last fall. And we thought, in your category of no regrets, so we're creating a Belgian charity. And if in the end Britain never leaves and all's the same, well, we sort of have warehoused this charity, and we can choose how much revenue to run through it. But it would be hard if we were starting now. We'd never have it in place by the end of October.
I think just to kind of add, I think we tend to think of ourselves as the centre of the universe in Britain, as probably the Americans do, and so we have an overemphasis on our own importance, and that, because it's a problem to us British, of course it's a problem to the rest of the world, and we forget that we're an island, a relatively small island off the coast of northwest Europe, that doesn't really register on a lot of countries' radars. So I think that's the reason why it's not hit boards over here, because it's just seen as a British problem and it doesn't affect their businesses. I think what we've seen in the past 6 months or so, as it's become clear that there is a real danger of us crashing out, that it's gone up the board agenda. It's tended to be logistics and supply chain driven or tax driven, and I think what we're trying to get companies to think about is holistically, tax, finance, HR, operations, commercial, coming together to think about what is our Brexit plan, because you can't just have a plan that deals with the tariffs. You need to have a plan that deals with kind of everything, and that's starting to happen over here, but it's a bit slower.
We have time for one more question, and there was one submitted in advance I'll just pose, and that is, a comment was made that the European Union has a lot of very stringent and onerous regulations. You mentioned the REACH regulations for chemical companies. More recently, GDPR, the data protection regulation that came into effect in the European Union, which puts very strict requirements on those entities that process information. If Brexit happens, if the UK exits from the EU, if you're operating in the UK, are you then relieved of compliance with a lot of these EU regulations?
No.
No. Oh.
So I think our feeling is anything we've signed up to, we're unlikely to roll back, and indeed the UK has been at the forefront of a lot of these new regulations. So I think what has been marked is that when the Brexiteers talk about freeing ourselves of the shackles of EU regulation, there's the information and the detail on, well, which particular regulation would you get rid of? And what's the impact on UK individuals, companies, is quite light in my experience. So things like REACH, it's about chemicals, it's about safely storing, moving chemicals across border. I'm not sure which government would weaken those regulations and you end up with a chemical disaster. Equally with some of the food standards regulations, again, the press would be very negative if it's seen that we're weakening regulation in that area. GDPR, the UK government announced earlier this week that we were going to, maintain GDPR, but to introduce more stringent fines and regulation on, the internet industry as it operates in the UK. So, the UK has been at the forefront of a lot of this new regulation. I can't see it rolling it back.
And just very briefly, I agree completely, but we drafted quite a lot of the new regulations, financial services in particular. There's can be no question of us going back on those.
Charlie, last word.
It's a reality. If you're in the international trading business, you either have to meet, for your product standards and regulations, you have to meet EU standards to sell to the EU. You have to meet US standards to sell to the US. And possibly Japanese standards or Chinese standards or what have you. And that's just the reality. The UK on its own outside of the EU for anything that has any trade in services, trade in goods kinds of business has no prospect of establishing distinct and eccentric national standards and making them stick. UK-based businesses will have to meet EU standards whether or not they're in the EU, just like US businesses exporting to the EU have to meet EU standards.
Well, I think we can maybe close on that agreement among our panel. I want to thank our panelists. I want to thank David in London for his participation. I want to thank all of you for coming and listening, and hopefully you learned something. I believe the panelists may hang around for a few minutes, so if there's any particular individual question that you want to speak with one of the panelists individually about, feel free to come up and do that. But thank you, everybody, and we'll adjourn the program formally now.